The crystal chandeliers of Le Nautique cast fractured rainbows across the private dining room, each prism of light worth more than most people earned in a year. Ethan Cross swirled his third glass of Chateau Margaux, watching the dark liquid catch the glow like liquid rubies. Around the table, his circle of
You guys
friends,
remember that deal?
men who
Unbelievable,
measured success
right?
in
And now with the new
zeros
property.
and power in
Indeed. Cheers to
handshakes,
that. You're
laughed
impossible.
at a joke he'd already forgotten. Marcus Wellington loosened his Hermes tie and leaned back in his chair. "You're too cynical, Cross. Not everything can be bought." Ethan's jaw tightened with the hint of a smile. At 34, he'd built an empire from Baltimore row houses to Manhattan penthouses, transforming skylines and bank accounts with equal precision. He'd learned early that everything, every single thing, had a price tag: love, loyalty, even dignity. A person just had to know the currency. "Name one thing," Ethan challenged, leaning back in his chair with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never lost. Sophia Martinez's diamond earrings caught the light as she leaned forward. "Love. Real love. The kind that doesn't care about your portfolio." The table erupted in philosophical debate, voices rising and falling like the tide outside the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows. Ethan remained silent, calculating. These people, his friends supposedly, were the same ones who'd mortgaged their marriages for a good merger. They spoke of love like tourists spoke of exotic destinations they'd never visit. "I'll prove it," Ethan said suddenly, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. The table fell silent. "Give me any woman, someone completely outside our world. I'll marry her, and within 3 months she'll walk, talk, and carry herself like she was born into it, like she belongs in rooms like this." He gestured around the opulent space, his eyes glinting with something between amusement and contempt. James Carrington, a hedge fund manager with more ex-wives than successful quarters, barked a laugh. "You're serious?" "10 million says I can do it," Ethan replied coolly. "Each of you puts in 2. If I fail, you split it. If I succeed, it goes to the charity of my choice, and you all admit that transformation is just another commodity." The bet was made with handshakes and knowing smirks. They thought him arrogant, and perhaps he was. But Ethan had never confused arrogance with inaccuracy. 7 days later, Ethan found himself in the lobby of the Grandeur Hotel, a property he'd acquired 3 months prior. He hadn't planned to visit, his assistant handled such mundane inspections, but a discrepancy in the quarterly report demanded his attention. Numbers didn't lie, but people did, and he wanted to see the bleeding with his own eyes. The lobby gleamed with manufactured elegance, marble floors buffed to mirrors, staff moving like synchronized dancers in their crisp uniforms. Ethan noticed everything: the slightly wilted orchids at the concierge desk, the bellhop who checked his phone when he thought no one was watching, the way the afternoon light exposed streaks on the supposedly pristine windows. He was making mental notes for the manager's termination when it happened. A collision, a splash of scalding liquid across his Tom Ford jacket, a gasp that sounded like a prayer and an apology combined. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Sir, I wasn't looking, I was rushing to." The woman's voice trembled with genuine horror as she grabbed napkins from her cart, dabbing frantically at his ruined jacket. "Please, I'll pay for the cleaning. I'll cover it, I promise." Ethan's first instinct was fury. His second was to notice her hands, reddened and raw from chemicals, moving with desperate precision. His third was to actually look at her face. She was younger than him, maybe 26, with dark hair pulled into a practical bun and eyes the color of honey in sunlight. No makeup softened her features. No expensive creams hid the faint circles under her eyes. She wore the exhaustion of double shifts like a second skin. Her uniform hung slightly too large on her frame, and her shoes, practical, worn sneakers beneath the pressed slacks, told stories of long hours and aching feet. "How much do you make here?" Ethan asked, his voice calm despite the coffee dripping from his sleeve. She froze, napkins still clutched in her hands. "Sir, I really am sorry. I'll speak to my supervisor about—" "Answer the question." Her chin lifted slightly, a flash of pride breaking through the panic. $14 an hour, plus whatever tips I make cleaning rooms, she paused. Not that it's relevant to your jacket. $14 an hour. He'd paid more for the coffee she'd spilled. What's your name? He asked. Lila. She pronounced it like a secret. Lila Reyes. Around them, the lobby continued its choreographed dance of luxury. Guests glided by in designer clothes, discussing dinner reservations and spa appointments. The fountain in the center splashed with mechanized serenity. No one noticed the billionaire and the maid, frozen in their small collision. Lila, Ethan repeated, testing the name. Something in his chest shifted, a recalibration of variables he hadn't anticipated. How would you like to make more money than you've ever imagined? Her eyes narrowed with suspicion, intelligence sparking despite her obvious poverty. I'm not that kind of person. Neither am I. He pulled out his card, holding it between two fingers. But I am the kind of person who sees potential. Call this number tomorrow at 9 a.m. We'll discuss an opportunity. She didn't take the card immediately. Instead, she studied his face like she was reading a contract's fine print, searching for the trap. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied some internal calculation because she finally accepted it, her fingers careful not to touch his. Ethan Cross, she read aloud, then looked up sharply. You own this hotel. I own 147 hotels, he corrected. This is just one of them. That night, as Ethan sat in his penthouse overlooking the city's glittering sprawl, he thought about Lila's hands. Honest hands, working hands, hands that had probably never held anything they hadn't earned. He thought about her suspicion, her pride, the way she'd looked at his business card like it might bite. He thought about the bet. And for the first time in years, Ethan Cross felt something other than boredom. He felt curious. Lila didn't call the number on the card. For 3 days, it sat on her nightstand like a small white grenade, elegant and dangerous. She'd wake at 5 a.m., see it in the dim light, and feel something between hope and nausea twist in her stomach before rushing to catch the first bus to work. On the fourth morning, someone knocked on her apartment door at 7 a.m. She answered in her waitressing uniform from her second job, coffee breath and exhaustion radiating from her like heat from pavement. The last person she expected to see was Ethan Cross, immaculate in a charcoal suit holding roses the color of fresh blood. You didn't call, he said simply. Behind her, the apartment told its own story. Peeling wallpaper her mother had tried to cover with discount store paintings, furniture held together with hope and duct tape, the persistent drip from the bathroom sink they couldn't afford to fix. The morning light was unforgiving, exposing every crack in the plaster, every stain on the carpet that no amount of scrubbing could erase. How did you find me? Her voice came out sharper than intended. I own half the city. Finding one hotel maid isn't difficult. He extended the roses. May I come in? No. She didn't take the flowers. Whatever you're selling, I can't afford it. I'm not selling anything. I'm offering you an opportunity. Men like you don't offer opportunities to women like me without wanting something in return. You're right, he said, and his honesty caught her off guard. I do want something, but it's not what you're imagining. From inside the apartment came a cough, wet and rattling, the kind that seized your lungs and wouldn't let go. Her brother Miguel, 15 years old and fighting a battle his body was losing. The sound made her flinch, made her armor crack just slightly. Ethan heard it too, his eyes shifted past her, taking in details she couldn't hide. The medical bills stacked on the kitchen counter, the pill bottles lined up like soldiers, the wheelchair folded in the corner. Let me buy you breakfast, he said quietly. 1 hour. If you don't like what I have to say, you'll never see me again. She should have said no. Every instinct screamed danger, but Miguel coughed again, and Lila thought about the surgery consultation sitting in her email with a price tag that might as well have been the moon, impossible, distant, mocking. 1 hour, she agreed. The cafe was nothing like the places Ethan usually frequented. Cracked vinyl booths, coffee that tasted like burnt promises, a waitress who called everyone Hon and meant it. He looked absurdly out of place, and Lila took petty satisfaction in his discomfort. You want to marry me, she said flatly after he'd explained. Not a question, an accusation. Yes. For a bet. Yes. She laughed, but it held no humour. Let me understand this. You and your rich friends made a wager about whether you could turn a poor girl into a lady, and you chose me because I spilled coffee on you. I chose you because when you looked at me, you weren't impressed. He leaned forward, his espresso untouched. Everyone I meet wants something from me. Money, connections, access. You looked at me like I was an inconvenience. You were an inconvenience. I almost got fired. Did you? No. She paused. My supervisor said the owner sent word that it was an accident, that I shouldn't be penalized. Her eyes narrowed. That was you. He didn't deny it. Lila stirred her coffee, watching the cheap cream swirl into patterns that collapsed and reformed. What exactly do you get out of this, besides winning your disgusting bet? Proof that transformation is transactional, that given the right resources, anyone can become anything. And what do I get, besides being your experiment? $2 million, paid in full the day you signed the prenup. He slid an envelope across the table. Plus all expenses covered during the marriage. After 3 months, we divorce quietly. You keep the money, your reputation intact, and a network of connections that will open doors for the rest of your life. $2 million. The number echoed in her skull like a church bell. Miguel's surgery cost $400,000. Her mother's mortgage, $60,000. Her own student loans from the nursing degree she'd had to abandon, $30,000. She could pay it all and still have enough left to actually live instead of just survive. Why me? She asked again, softer this time. Ethan was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice carried something she hadn't heard before, uncertainty. Because I think you're the only person who might actually say no. I should say no. Yes, you should. She looked at him then, really looked, past the expensive suit and the perfect hair and the face that belonged on magazine covers. She saw something else, a man playing a game because the game was all he knew, because without it, he might have to face whatever emptiness lived behind his eyes. If I do this, she said slowly, I have conditions. Name them. My family doesn't know the truth for this. Ever. As far as they're concerned, this is real. Agreed. I'm not sleeping with you. Separate rooms, separate lives behind closed doors. Of course. And when it's over, you don't get to keep tabs on me. No checking in, no contact, no using your connections to interfere in my life. We become strangers again. Something in his expression shuttered. Understood. Lila drained her coffee, tasting bitterness and possibility in equal measure. She thought about Miguel's face when she told him they could afford the surgery. She thought about her mother crying with relief. She thought about the version of herself she might become in 3 months, polished, transformed, unrecognizable. She thought about the version of herself she might lose. I want to see the contract, she said finally. I want my own lawyer to review it. And I want one more thing. What? Honesty. Whatever this is between us, business arrangement, social experiment, whatever, I want honesty. No games, no manipulation. If you're going to turn me into your project, at least respect me enough to be truthful. Ethan extended his hand across the table. Deal. His palm was smooth, uncalloused, the hand of someone who'd never had to scrub floors or wash dishes until their fingers bled. When she shook it, she felt the gulf between their worlds in that simple touch, his certainty, her desperation, both of them pretending this was just business. 3 weeks later, Lila stood in a designer wedding dress that cost more than her annual salary, in a courthouse that smelled of old paperwork and broken promises. No flowers, no music, no fairy tale. Just signatures and witnesses and Ethan's hand, still smooth, still foreign, sliding a ring onto her finger that caught the fluorescent light like captured stars. You may kiss the bride, the judge said with bureaucratic indifference. Ethan's lips brushed hers with the practiced neutrality of a business transaction. She tasted mint and money, and something else, maybe regret, maybe resignation. When they walked out into the afternoon sun, photographers materialized like vultures. Ethan had warned her they would come. His publicist had crafted a story, whirlwind romance, love at first sight, a modern fairy tale. Lila smiled for the cameras, her cheeks aching with the effort, while Ethan's arm around her waist felt like a shackle made of silk. Behind the glamour and the flashbulbs and the headlines that would read, "Billionaire bachelor finally settles down," Lila carried one truth in her chest like a stone. She was Mrs. Lila Cross now, living in a mansion with a man she barely knew, playing a role in someone else's story, just a pawn in his game. But pawns, her father had once told her while teaching her chess, could become queens if they survived long enough to reach the other side of the board. Lila intended to survive. The first event was a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum, where admission cost more than Lila's childhood home. Ethan's stylist had dressed her in midnight blue silk that whispered against her skin like secrets, uncomfortable and foreign. The diamonds at her throat felt like ice, beautiful and suffocating. "Remember," Ethan said in the car, his eyes on his phone rather than her, "you're observing tonight. Watch how they move, how they speak. Mirror them." "Like a trained monkey," she muttered. His jaw tightened, but he didn't disagree. The museum's great hall glittered with Manhattan's elite. Women whose cheekbones could cut glass, men whose handshakes wielded more power than some governments. Lila felt their eyes on her the moment she entered, assessing and dismissing her in a single sweep. She recognized the look. It was the same one hotel guests gave her when she cleaned their rooms, the look that said, "You're invisible, you're nobody, you don't matter." Except now she was visible. Now she mattered. And somehow that was worse. "Ethan, darling!" A woman in crimson approached, her smile sharp as a knife. Sophia Martinez from the Bet, though Lila didn't know that. "You must introduce us to your bride." The pause before bride landed like a slap. "Sophia, this is Lila. Lila, Sophia runs the Martinez Foundation." Ethan's hand rested on Lila's lower back, proprietary and cold. "Enchanted," Sophia purred, her eyes cataloguing every imperfection. "Tell me, Lila, where did you two meet? Ethan's been so mysterious about the whole whirlwind romance." "At a hotel," Lila answered honestly. "How quaint." "Were you staying there?" The question hung in the air like poison. Lila felt Ethan's hand tense against her spine. "I worked there," she said, lifting her chin, "as a maid." The silence that followed felt like drowning. Sophia's eyes widened with delighted malice. Nearby, conversations paused, ears tuning in like radio frequencies finding a signal. "How refreshingly honest," Sophia managed, her voice dripping with something that wasn't quite approval. Ethan always did have unconventional taste. The evening spiraled from there. Lila's accent, the way she said asked instead of the crisp northeastern asked, the slight roll of her R's inherited from her mother's Spanish, became a spectator sport. She watched them exchange glances when she mispronounced moe, when she used the wrong fork for the seafood course, when she laughed too loudly at a joke and then realized, too late, that she was the only one laughing. Marcus Wellington, drink in hand and cruelty in his eyes, cornered her by the dessert table. "So, Mrs. Cross," he said, the title mocking in his mouth. "What do you think of Rothko?" He gestured to a painting on the wall, blocks of colour that looked like a child's mistake to her untrained eye. "It's interesting," she tried. "Interesting." He smiled. "Yes, I suppose that's one word for $60 million worth of artistic genius. Tell me, what did you study? Art history? Comparative literature?" "I studied nursing." She met his gaze. "Before I had to drop out." "Ah." He took a sip of his scotch. "How practical." The word practical in his mouth sounded like worthless. Ethan rescued her then, his hand on her elbow, steering her away with murmured apologies. But she saw it in his eyes too. That flicker of embarrassment, quickly masked. She was his experiment failing in real time, his project showing its cracks under pressure. The lessons began the next day. Madame Beaumont, a 70-year-old Frenchwoman with a spine like steel and a voice like cut crystal, arrived at 8 a.m. sharp. "You walk like a servant," were her first words to Lila. "Not cruel, just factual. We must erase this." For hours, Lila balanced books on her head, learning to glide rather than stride, to take up space with grace rather than apologize for her existence with every step. Her feet bled in the designer heels. Her back screamed from the enforced posture. Madame Beaumont showed no mercy. "Again! No, no, you are not scrubbing floors now. You are floating. Lighter. Like you belong." The stylist, a thin man named Dominic who spoke in sighs and disappointments, educated her on fabrics, cuts, the silent language of fashion. "Silk says elegance, leather says power. That polyester you wore when you arrived," said Clearance Rack. The etiquette coach, Patricia, taught her the difference between 12 types of spoons, the proper way to refuse a dish without offending the host, how to make small talk that said nothing but sounded like everything. Through it all, Ethan was absent. He left for work before she woke, returned after she'd gone to bed. They were strangers sharing an address, a last name, nothing more. Sometimes she'd see him in the hallway of their penthouse, and he'd nod like she was staff, his eyes already on his phone, his mind in boardrooms she'd never enter. 2 weeks into her transformation, Ethan hosted a dinner party. His inner circle, the same people who'd watched her stumble at the gala. Lila wore white, Dominic's choice, strategic as warfare. "Make them see a blank canvas," he'd said. "Make them wonder what's being painted." She'd practiced. God, how she'd practiced. Every word measured, every gesture controlled. She was a performance of herself, polished and artificial and exhausting. The evening went smoothly until she excused herself to the bathroom. On her way back, voices drifted from Ethan's study, the door slightly ajar, warm light spilling into the hallway like an invitation to heartbreak. "You actually married her? For a bet?" James Carrington's voice, thick with alcohol and amusement. "Man, you're heartless." "It's not heartless," Marcus argued. "It's brilliant. Look at her. She actually thinks she can become one of us." "Does she know?" Sophia asked. "About the bet?" "Of course not." Ethan's voice, smooth and detached. "That would defeat the purpose. She needs to believe it's real for the transformation to be authentic." "And after?" James pressed. "After you've won your little wager?" A pause. Then, after she goes back to her world with enough money to be comfortable. Everyone wins. Lila's hand found the wall, steadying herself. The hallway tilted, rearranged itself into something uglier. Her world with enough money to be comfortable. Like she was a problem being solved, a stray cat being fed before being sent back to the streets. She didn't return to the dinner party. Instead, she walked to her room, her separate lonely room in this mansion of mirrors and lies, and locked the door. The white dress came off like shedding skin. The careful makeup dissolved under water and tears that came in waves, relentless and drowning. She cried until her throat was raw, until the sky outside her window shifted from black to grey to the pale pink of dawn. She cried for the girl she'd been, for the woman she was becoming, for the version of herself caught between two worlds and belonging to neither. But as the sun rose over Manhattan, something else rose in her too. Rage. Not the hot, explosive kind that burned out quickly. The cold, calculating kind that could reshape mountains given enough time. They wanted a transformation. She'd give them one. But not for Ethan's bet. Not for his friend's amusement. Not even for the money anymore. For herself. She'd learn their language, master their games, walk through their world with the confidence of someone who'd earned her place rather than bought it. And when she was done, when she could stand in any room and belong, not because she'd erased herself, but because she'd expanded herself, then she'd walk away. On her terms, in her time. Lila Cross looked at herself in the mirror, eyes red but clear. Somewhere in the reflection, she saw both versions of herself, the maid who scrubbed floors and the woman who'd learned to glide across them. She would become the queen on this chessboard, and when the game was over, she'd be the only one still standing. The library became her war room. While Ethan believed she spent her days at spa appointments and shopping on Fifth Avenue, Lila was devouring his world from the inside out. She started with the basics. Rich Dad, Poor Dad, the lean startup. Anything that explained how money actually moved rather than just how to spend it. But quickly, she graduated to something darker: corporate espionage, mergers and acquisitions, the psychology of negotiation. She wasn't just learning to survive in Ethan's world, she was learning to conquer it. At 4 a.m., when the penthouse was silent except for the hum of the city below, Lila sat cross-legged on the marble floor with her laptop balanced on a throw pillow, enrolling in online courses under a fake name: Elena Martinez, Corporate Finance, Business Strategy, Organizational Behavior. She absorbed lectures while wearing yesterday's clothes, her hair unwashed, her eyes burning from screen glare and ambition. The courses weren't enough. She needed to understand Ethan specifically, how his mind worked, what made him dangerous in boardrooms, why men twice his age deferred to his judgment. So she became a student of him. She watched every interview he'd ever given, going back a decade. Early Ethan was hungrier, rougher around the edges, more willing to show his teeth. She noted when he'd learned to soften his approach, to make brutality sound like common sense. She studied his tells, the way he touched his watch when someone was boring him, how his left eyebrow lifted microscopically when he'd found a weakness to exploit. She read every article written about Cross Enterprises, including the hit pieces, especially the hit pieces. The lawsuits he'd buried, the competitors he'd crushed, the communities displaced by his developments. She wasn't looking for reasons to judge him, she was looking for patterns, for the blueprint of power. One night, she found an interview from 8 years ago where he'd said something that lodged in her chest like a splinter. "Sentiment is expensive. I prefer profit." That was the night Lila realized she was married to a man who'd turned himself into a machine, and she was learning to become one too. But she didn't want to be a machine. She wanted to be something he'd never expect. A woman who could think like him but feel like herself, who could calculate odds while still remembering what it felt like to pray over empty bank accounts. The shift happened gradually, then all at once. Lila stopped wearing the clothes Dominic selected, the peacock displays meant to advertise Ethan's wealth. Instead, she studied what female CEOs wore: sharp blazers in black and grey, silk blouses that whispered rather than shouted, heels that added height without stealing balance. She cut her hair shorter, easier to manage, more severe, professional. When she walked into rooms now, people's eyes no longer dropped to her hemline or her jewellery. They met her face. Madame Beaumont noticed first. "You move differently now," she observed during what would be their final lesson. "Less like you're trying to belong, more like you're deciding whether they belong." "Is that good?" Lila asked. The old woman smiled, a rare, genuine expression. "That is power, ma chérie, and power is always good if you know how to use it." The real test came at a board dinner Ethan hosted at the penthouse. 12 men in expensive suits discussing a commercial development deal in Singapore worth $400 million. Lila wasn't supposed to be there. These dinners were business, not social, but she walked in anyway, poured herself a scotch she'd learned to tolerate, if not enjoy, and sat at the empty chair at the table's head. The conversation died. "Lila," Ethan said carefully, "we're in the middle of a negotiation that's going to fall apart if you proceed with the current structure," she interrupted, her voice calm. "You're offering 20% equity for their land access, but they're going to counter at 35 because they've done the math and they know you need their port connections more than they need your capital." Marcus Wellington laughed, the sound ugly and dismissive. "And what would you suggest, Mrs. Cross, since you're apparently a real estate expert now?" Lila didn't flinch. "Offer 15% equity and guaranteed first-position contracts for the next 3 Singapore projects. They get long-term security instead of short-term gain. You maintain majority control and lock them into partnership terms that favour you for years." The room was silent. Then James Carrington, who'd been studying his tablet, looked up slowly. "That actually works. Better than our current model." Ethan stared at her like she'd materialized from thin air. "Where did you learn this?" "I've been watching you," she said simply. "Turns out I'm a good student when I'm motivated." After the dinner, after the men left with new strategies and sideways glances at the billionaire's wife who'd outthought them all, Ethan found her in the library, surrounded by her textbooks and notes, evidence she could no longer hide. "How long?" he asked. "Since the night I heard you laughing about your bet." She didn't look up from her laptop. "I decided if I was going to be your experiment, I might as well make it interesting." He stepped closer, picking up one of her notebooks, flipping through pages of her careful analysis, her dissection of his business model, her strategies for improvement. His strategies, made better. "You've been studying me," he said quietly. "Studying business," she corrected. "You just happen to be a case study." Something crossed his face, hurt maybe, or something more complicated. "Why are you telling me this now? You could have kept it secret." "Because I'm tired of secrets." Lila finally met his eyes. "And because the bet's almost over. 2 more weeks and I get my money, you get your proof that transformation is transactional, and we both go back to pretending this never happened. So it doesn't matter anymore if you know." The truth sat between them like a third person in the room. Then Ethan got sick. It started with a cough he ignored, then a fever that spiked to dangerous levels. Pneumonia, the doctor said, aggressive, demanding rest and round-the-clock monitoring. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan Cross was forced to surrender control. Lila didn't hesitate. She became the gatekeeper, the translator, the bridge between his empire and his absence. She answered calls in his voice, not literally, but in tone, in certainty. She made decisions he would have made, solved problems using the playbook she'd memorized from months of observation. A crisis erupted in Boston, a contractor threatening to abandon a $50 million project over permit delays. Lila called the city planning office herself. Then the contractor, then arranged a video conference with 3 different bureaucrats, navigating political waters like she'd been doing it her whole life. "Tell Mr. Cross I handled it," she said to his lead architect, her voice steady with authority she'd earned. "The permit's clear by Friday." She worked from a chair beside Ethan's bed, laptop casting blue light across both their faces. She made soup, her mother's recipe, the kind that tasted like home and healing, and fed it to him when his hands shook too badly to hold the spoon. "Why are you doing this?" he asked one night, his voice rough. "Because someone has to." "You could let it burn. Let me fail. Isn't that what I deserve?" Lila was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe, but watching you fail doesn't make me better. Only being better makes me better." On the 7th day, his fever broke. On the 8th, he was strong enough to sit her up. On the 9th, he found her asleep in the chair beside his bed, her laptop still open, showing a spreadsheet she'd built tracking every decision she'd made, every call she'd answered, every crisis she'd managed. He saved the file to his personal drive before gently closing the laptop. When Lila woke, Ethan was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "You saved my company," he said. "I saved your reputation," she corrected. "The company's too big to fail from one bad week." "Why?" She met his eyes. This man who'd married her as a bet, who'd turned her into a project, who'd underestimated her so completely he'd handed her the keys to his kingdom without realizing it. "Because I wanted to prove I could," she said. "Not to you, to myself. And in that moment, Ethan Cross realized he'd created something far more dangerous than a polished version of a maid. He'd created his equal. The invitation arrived on heavy cardstock embossed with gold lettering. The annual Metropolitan Charity Gala, honoring excellence in philanthropy. 3 months had passed since their wedding, and the bet's deadline loomed exactly 1 week away. Ethan held the invitation like it was evidence in a trial he was losing. "We should go," Lila said from the doorway, her voice neutral. She'd stopped asking his permission for things weeks ago. "You don't have to," Ethan replied, not looking up. "These events are where your friends gather to measure their wealth against human suffering and call it charity." She stepped into his office, her heels clicking against marble with the confidence of someone who'd learned to walk, like she owned the ground beneath her feet. "I know exactly what they are. That's why we're going." Something in her tone made him look up. She stood backlit by the afternoon sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing a simple black dress that somehow made her look more formidable than any gown could. Her hair was pulled back severely, her makeup minimal, her posture that of a woman who'd stopped apologizing for taking up space. She was magnificent and terrifying. "Lila, the bet ends in 7 days, Ethan." Her voice was steady, clinical. "Let them see what you created. Let them witness your grand experiment's conclusion. Isn't that what you wanted? Proof?" The word hung between them like an accusation. The gala was held at the Plaza Hotel in the same ballroom where Vanderbilts had once waltzed and Rockefellers had brokered deals that shaped nations. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across a sea of designer gowns and tuxedos, each outfit costing more than most families' annual income. The irony of fundraising for poverty amid such opulence wasn't lost on Lila. She arrived alone. Ethan had been delayed by a conference call with Tokyo, or so he claimed. Lila suspected he was giving her space to fail, one last test before the experiment concluded. She wouldn't fail. The moment she entered, conversations stuttered and died like candles in wind. Sophia Martinez's champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. Marcus Wellington's laugh cut off mid-sound. James Carrington straightened from his conversation circle, his expression shifting from boredom to something approaching alarm. Lila wore crimson, not the safe, expected black of society women, but a red so deep it looked like spilled wine, like blood, like warning. The dress was elegant but severe, cut to emphasize strength rather than softness. Her hair fell in loose waves past her shoulders, but her eyes, lined dark and sharp, said she was nobody's decoration. "Is that," someone whispered. "The maid," another voice confirmed, the word dripping with something between fascination and horror. Lila walked through the crowd like a knife through silk, accepting champagne from a server who didn't recognize her as one of his former colleagues. She'd worked events like this once, invisible in black and white uniform, cleaning up the messes of people who never learned her name. Now they couldn't look away. "Lila!" Sophia materialized beside her, all sharp edges and calculating eyes. "You look different." "I am different," Lila replied evenly. "Isn't that the point?" "Where's Ethan?" "Working. Some of us have to actually earn our fortunes rather than inherit them." The barb landed precisely. Sophia's family wealth was old money, built on the backs of industry her great-grandfather had monopolized. Sophia's smile tightened. "You've developed quite the sharp tongue. I suppose Ethan trained that into you too." "No," Lila said softly, dangerously. "That I've always had. I just learned when to use it." Marcus Wellington approached, flanked by 2 other men from Ethan's inner circle. "Mrs. Cross, how unexpected to see you here alone." "Is it? I go where I please now. One of the benefits of transformation, you stop waiting for permission." "Transformation," Marcus repeated, tasting the word. "Is that what we're calling it? I would have said makeover." "You would say that," Lila agreed pleasantly, "because you're the kind of man who thinks surfaces are all that matter, that a new dress and better posture are what define change." She stepped closer, her voice dropping so only their small circle could hear. But real transformation happens here, she tapped her temple, and here, her hand moved to her chest, in places your money can't touch and your cynicism can't measure. The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't the nervous maid who'd spilled coffee, nor even the quiet observer who'd endured their mockery. This was something else entirely, someone who'd learned their language and now spoke it better than they did. "You're upset," James Carrington observed, his voice attempting diplomacy. "About the bet, I assume. Ethan told you?" The world tilted. Lila's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. "Told me what?" The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus's face drained of colour. James looked like he might be sick. Sophia's eyes widened with something that looked almost like glee, the anticipation of watching something beautiful shatter. "Oh God," Marcus breathed. "You didn't know. He never told you." "Told me what?" Lila repeated, her voice ice. "The bet," Sophia said, unable to resist twisting the knife. "The entire reason he married you. We wagered $10 million that he couldn't take someone from your background and turn them into one of us within 3 months. You were the experiment, darling, all of this." She gestured at Lila, at the dress, at the transformation. Was just Ethan proving a point? The ballroom spun. Lila's training kicked in. Keep your face neutral, don't let them see the wound, maintain control. But something inside her was screaming, breaking, dying. She'd known. Of course she'd known. She'd overheard them that night 3 months ago. But some part of her, some stupid, naive, desperate part, had hoped she'd been wrong, had hoped that somewhere in the past 90 days it had become real. That when he looked at her now, he saw a person, not a project. That the late-night conversations, the way he'd started asking her opinion on deals, the morning coffee he'd begun making for both of them, that it had meant something. "Excuse me," Lila said, her voice remarkably steady. "I need some air." She made it exactly 12 steps before she heard his voice. "Lila, wait!" Ethan stood at the ballroom entrance, still in his overcoat, his face stricken. He'd heard everything. The guilt radiating from him was palpable, pathetic. "Don't," she said simply. "Just don't." But he followed her anyway, catching her arm as she reached the terrace overlooking Central Park. The city sprawled below them, millions of lights in the darkness, millions of lives being lived by people who weren't puppets in someone else's social experiment. "I was going to tell you," he said. "When? After you collected your winnings?" Her laugh was bitter, broken. "Or were you going to wait until after the divorce? Send me a nice note with my $2 million. Thanks for playing along, sorry about the psychological manipulation." It wasn't supposed to be like this. "Like what, Ethan? Like what exactly?" She spun to face him, and for the first time since they'd met, she didn't hide her tears. "You married me as a bet. You turned my life into entertainment for your bored, cruel friends. You made me believe—" She stopped, biting off the words before they could escape. "Believe what?" he asked quietly. "That I mattered." The admission came out raw, wounded. That maybe somewhere in all of this pretending, something real had grown. That when you looked at me these past few weeks, you saw me. Not your project, not your experiment, me. "I do see you," Ethan said, and his voice cracked with something that sounded almost like honesty. "God, Lila, I see you. That's the problem. That's what I wasn't prepared for." "What are you talking about?" "I was supposed to prove a point, transform someone, win a bet, go back to my life unchanged." He ran a hand through his hair, destroying its careful styling. "But you didn't just transform. You evolved. You took everything I thought I knew about value and worth and turned it inside out. You made me question everything." "So this is my fault now." Her voice rose, sharp with pain. "I'm sorry my humanity inconvenienced your social experiment. I'm in love with you." The words detonated in the space between them like a grenade. Lila stared at him, unable to process, unable to breathe. What? I'm in love with you, Ethan repeated, stepping closer. I don't know when it happened. Maybe when you crashed that board meeting and made me look like an amateur. Maybe when you saved my company while I was sick. Maybe the very first day when you spilled coffee on me and apologized like your life depended on it. And I saw someone who still believed sorry meant something. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. You were supposed to be beneath me, an experiment, proof that transformation is just another transaction. And instead, Lila's voice shook, instead you became the only real thing in my life. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, too stunned to pull away. You want to know the truth? The bet ended weeks ago. I called it off, told them all I forfeited, because continuing meant reducing you to a wager. And you're worth more than all their money combined. Lila pulled her hand back like she'd been burned. You're lying. I'm not. You're lying because the bet ends in 7 days, because you need me to play along until… The bet ended the night you told me you wanted to be your own investment, Ethan interrupted. Because in that moment, I realized I wasn't teaching you anything. You were teaching me about value that can't be bought, about worth that doesn't live in bank accounts, about becoming someone better, not because someone's watching, but because it's who you choose to be. The tears came harder now, and Lila hated herself for them, hated him for causing them, hated the whole beautiful, terrible mess of her transformed life. I don't believe you, she whispered. Then let me prove it. Before she could protest, Ethan walked back into the ballroom, Lila following in confused, angry bewilderment. He strode directly to the stage where the evening's host was preparing to introduce the keynote speaker. Ethan took the microphone and the room fell silent. I need to say something, he began, his voice carrying across crystal and wealth and judgment. 3 months ago, I made a bet with some people in this room. I wagered that I could marry someone from outside our world and transform her into one of us. I chose Lila, my wife, as my experiment, my project, my proof that people are just malleable things that money can reshape. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lila stood frozen at the ballroom's edge, every eye turning to find her. I was wrong, Ethan continued, not because the transformation didn't happen, it did. Lila learned everything I tried to teach her, and then she surpassed me in ways I didn't know were possible. But I was wrong because she didn't become one of us. He paused, finding her in the crowd. She became something better. She became everything we pretend to be. Intelligent, capable, compassionate, genuine. She transformed not by erasing who she was, but by expanding it. And in doing so, she transformed me. The silence was absolute. I called off the bet weeks ago, Ethan said. I forfeited. Because the moment I realized I'd fallen in love with my wife, she stopped being a wager and became the only thing in my life that actually matters. His voice softened. Lila, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I've hurt you in ways I can never take back. But if you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving that you weren't my experiment. You were my awakening. The microphone clicked off. The ballroom remained silent, hundreds of people holding their breath, waiting for her response. Lila walked forward slowly, every step an eternity. When she reached the stage, Ethan descended to meet her. They stood facing each other in the middle of Manhattan's elite, raw and exposed, and utterly alone despite the crowd. Some people think money changes people, Lila said, her voice steady and clear, carrying across the ballroom without amplification. But it only reveals who they really are. It showed me who I could become when given the resources to grow. It showed Ethan who he'd become when success replaced substance. She paused, letting her words settle. Love, on the other hand, that changes everything. It forces you to see beyond transactions and transformations. It demands you recognize another person's humanity as equal to your own. She looked at Ethan, This man who'd hurt her and helped her, who'd underestimated her and then learned from her, who'd turned her life into a bet, and then, maybe, had learned what it meant to lose everything that mattered. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said quietly, just for him. "But I'm willing to find out." The ballroom erupted in applause, genuine, stunned, the kind reserved for moments that feel like witnessing history. And in that moment, Ethan Cross realized he hadn't just fallen in love with the woman he'd once thought beneath him. He'd fallen in love with the woman who'd risen so far above him that he'd spend the rest of his life trying to reach her level.